Hi everybody, I'm going to read you all a story today from this book. I got it out of the school library. It's called the Norfolk Story Book. In the book there's lots of short stories. The one that I'm going to read today is called A Mammoth Journey. Okay, so here we go. This story is set thousands and thousands of years ago, when the world was full of animals. Some of these animals are like the ones we see today, mice and hedgehogs and monkeys, but some of these animals have never been seen by the likes of you and me, such as the saber-toothed cat. He wasn't much like a cat at all, at least not like the nice fluffy pet cats you might have at home who curl up on your lap and play with wool. He was the most vicious looking cat you ever did see. He was called the saber-toothed cat because of two enormous and very sharp curved teeth he had on the front of his mouth. He was known throughout the land for his nasty temper and liked nothing better than to prowl the earth looking for trouble. But the saber-toothed cat wasn't the only big ferocious animal around. There were lions and rhinos and big fearsome bears, but by far the biggest of all these creatures, the mightiest and most revered, was the steppe mammoth. If you want to know how big a steppe mammoth was, imagine an elephant. Now, imagine that the elephant is much, much bigger. The steppe mammoth was absolutely gigantic. So big that if you stood on the ground and looked up at him, you would hardly be able to see his head. He would be so high up above you. The mammoth looked a bit like an elephant too. He had 4 legs with big heavy feet on which he clumped and stumped across the land. A long trunk which he could swish and swoosh about in the air, and on either side of his trunk 2 enormous tusks which he could swing and slash all around him. None of the dangerous animals dared to mess with the mammoth. Even the saber-toothed cat would have run to the hills if he saw the mammoth was coming. Luckily for the nicer animals, mammoths were herbivores. They ate herbs and leaves and shrubs which grew in the land around them. The mammoth in this story was a herbivore too, but even so, he never would have eaten another animal because he was quite a friendly creature. His favourite food was leaves. Mammoths didn't really have names back then, but for the purpose of this story, we'll call him Humphrey, because it seems like a mammoth-y sort of name. It was a warm summer's morning, and Humphrey the mammoth was munching on some leaves from a tree. But they weren't very tasty leaves. In fact, they had no flavour at all. "I don't think much of these leaves," said Humphrey to himself. "It must be because it's so warm in these parts, the sun has dried out the leaves and all the flavour has gone. I shall go on a journey to the north, where the sky is wetter and the leaves are tastier. It should only take me till the end of the day, if I walk quickly." Now, this was a funny thing to say because mammoths weren't good at walking quickly. They were so big and so heavy-footed that they could only walk very slowly. Nonetheless, Humphrey put his best foot forward and began to make his way north. He hadn't got very far, barely 3 steps forward even, when suddenly, from somewhere far below him, he heard a tiny voice. It was the teeniest, tiniest, squeakiest little voice you ever did hear. Excuse me, please," said the tiny voice. Humphrey looked down to see where the voice was coming from. Now remember, mammoths were so big that their feet were a long way down from their heads, so it took him a while to spot who was talking to him. At last, he caught sight of the creature, no bigger than a pebble, sitting on a rock far below him. It was a little mouse. The mouse was all furry and brown, with a quivering teeny black nose, pointy ears and whiskers. She stared up at Humphrey with her beady black eyes. Imagine how small she must have felt, a tiny thing, staring up at a great big, enormous Humphrey. She looked a little afraid too, because her body was shaking all over. The mouse cleared her throat, and said, "Pardon me, sir, my name is Molly." "Molly the mouse, and how do you do? I couldn't help but overhear that you're travelling to the north. I was wondering if I may possibly accompany you on your journey. You see, I've heard tell that the saber-toothed cat is travelling to these parts, and will be here in no less than a day. I'm very frightened of the saber-toothed cat. He eats little mice like me for breakfast." She looked down at her teeny, tiny, mousy feet. "I could ride on your back if that wouldn't be too much trouble." Humphrey listened attentively to what Molly had to say, but in spite of himself couldn't help but laugh. Not because he was being mean, but because he wasn't scared of the saber-toothed cat at all. Still, Humphrey didn't like to see animals that were so much smaller and more helpless than himself living in fear of the saber-toothed cat. He smiled kindly down at Molly. "But of course you may ride on my back, little Molly," he said. "It's no trouble at all. Climb up my trunk and onto my back." Humphrey swung his enormous trunk down to the ground for Molly to climb up. "Oh, thank you," said Molly, and faster than a flash of light she ran up Humphrey's trunk and nestled onto the skin of his gigantic back. "We should be north by the end of the day," said Humphrey. "And if that saber-toothed cat tries to stop us, well, I'd like to see him try." He chuckled to himself again. "Right, off we go." He was about to lift up his trunk when all of a sudden Molly cried out, "Wait! We can't go without my husband and 8 children." She called out, "Husband, 8 children, come along." And before Humphrey knew what was going on, 9 other little mice had scurried out from behind the rock and all at once dashed up his trunk and onto his gigantic back. Humphrey hadn't been expecting this, but still, he didn't mind in the least. He was so big and so strong that 10 mice on his back made no difference whatsoever. In fact, the whole group felt no heavier than a feather. And so, off headed Humphrey with 10 mice on his back up to the north where the sky was wetter and the leaves were tastier. At least, he tried to. No sooner had Humphrey started to walk than he suddenly felt something very sharp and prickly rub against his left front leg. The thing was so prickly it felt as though a pine cone was digging into his skin. "Ouch!" cried Humphrey. "What is that very sharp and prickly thing?" He looked down at his foot. "Pardon me, sir," said a muffled little voice from far, far below him, "but it's me." Humphrey darted his eyes across the ground until at last he saw a creature burrowed in a clump of grass. It was a little hedgehog. The hedgehog was a round, ball-shaped thing with a brown, furry face and prickles all over. "Hello," said the hedgehog. "My name is Harry the hedgehog, and how do you do? I hope you don't mind me jeopardising your journey, only I've just heard tell that the saber-toothed cat is travelling to these parts. I'm very scared of the saber-toothed cat. He makes playthings out of little hedgehogs like me. He'd pick off all my prickles and roll me around just for fun. Now, I've heard tell that you are travelling north, and well, it's not that I would ask normally, only I've also heard that you are taking a family of mice with you." "Wow," said Humphrey, raising his eyes. "News sure travels fast in this neck of the woods." "Well, yes," said Harry. "Even the trees have ears round here." He looked down at his tiny feet and his small brown face blushed to the colour of beetroot. "I was wondering, since you are taking the mice, perhaps you could take me too, if that wouldn't be too much trouble." "But of course," cried Humphrey, "it's no trouble at all. That saber-toothed cat doesn't scare me one bit, and I hate to see how much he scares you. You climb up on my back, my prickly friend. You'll be safe as can be with me. We should be north by the end of the day, and well away from that nasty saber-toothed cat." Humphrey swung down his enormous trunk for Harry to climb up. Harry curled himself into a prickly ball and rolled his way up Humphrey's trunk onto his gigantic back. "Your prickles tickle," laughed Humphrey. When Harry was safely on his back, Humphrey was about to lift up his trunk when all of a sudden Harry cried out, "Wait! We can't go without my wife and 6 children." And he called out, "Wife, 6 children, come along." And before Humphrey knew what was going on, 7 hedgehogs popped up their prickly heads from out of the grass, and like Harry, they curled themselves into little balls and one by one rolled up his trunk onto his gigantic back. Humphrey hadn't been expecting this. Still, he was so big and so strong that the whole group didn't make that much of a difference. And so, off headed Humphrey with 10 mice and 8 hedgehogs on his back up to the north, where the sky was wetter and the leaves were tastier. They hadn't got very far before Humphrey felt something slithery wrap around his back right leg. The slithery thing was very strong and like a tight coil of rope, and stopped him from moving any further. He glanced down and had to tilt his head right back to see his legs behind him. "What is that slithery thing wrapped around my back right leg?" Humphrey asked. "Pardon me, sir," came a soft, low, hissy voice, "but it's me." From the corner of his eye, Humphrey could just make out a grass snake. The grass snake was very well camouflaged and on the ground because it was small and green like a blade of grass. But Humphrey could still see his alert little eyes flickering forked tongue. Now Humphrey was a bit nervous around grass snakes. Even though they were small, they had an alarming habit of popping out of nowhere and taking him by surprise. There was something very unpredictable about the way they could move so fast, slippery and silent, so he always felt slightly on edge when he was around them. "I can't see you properly if you're hiding back there, you snake in the grass," Humphrey said. "Come to my front so I can face you, mammoth to snake." In no time at all, the grass snake had popped out of the grass in front of him. Humphrey was unsettled by the speed at which the snake had slithered from his back to his front. "Hello," the grass snake said. "My name is Gracie the grass snake, and how do you do? I hope you don't mind my sabotaging your stroll, but I've heard tell that the saber-toothed cat is travelling to these parts." "Yes," said Humphrey. "I think I know where this conversation is going. I suppose you want to ride on my back to the north." "I don't like the saber-toothed cat," said Gracie, and her slithery body, which had been so still and serene, began suddenly shaking in panic. "He'd tie my head to my tail and whirl me round his head like a lasso, wrap me around a tree and use me as a catapult." All right, Humphrey interrupted her. "I get the picture. Now, you grass snakes may well make me nervous, but you've never done me any harm. I'll let you on my back, but you must promise faithfully not to frighten the mice or hedgehogs." "Oh, I promise," said Gracie. Humphrey swung down his enormous trunk and allowed Gracie to slither up onto his back. He was about to lift up his trunk when all of a sudden Gracie cried, "Wait! We can't leave without my husband and 4 children." And she called out, "Husband, 4 children, come along." Humphrey barely even had time to blink before 5 other grass snakes materialised without warning out of the grass. It was all he could do to narrow his eyes and watch them, as one by one they shot up his trunk and onto his gigantic back. Humphrey hadn't been expecting this, and he was beginning to feel the extra weight. Still, it wasn't that bad, and so off headed Humphrey with 10 mice, 8 hedgehogs and 6 grass snakes on his back, up to the north where the sky was wetter and the leaves were tastier. They travelled for quite some distance when they came upon a large clump of trees. Humphrey was very glad of the shade. He was beginning to get a little worn out with all those animals on his back. "I'll just cool myself for a while under the branches of this nice tree," he said. He hadn't cooled himself for long when all of a sudden there came a great rustling in the tree tops above him. Then, as if from nowhere, a creature swinging on a branch came crashing through the trees and straight towards Humphrey. I've split this video into 2 parts. You have now reached the end of part 1. If you'd like to continue listening and listen to part 2, I'll put a link on screen for you to follow.